Have you ever thought about your 200-year legacy? That's our topic on today's episode of Friends Talk Financial Planning. Hi, I'm John Scherer, and I run a fee-only financial planning practice in Middleton, Wisconsin.
And I'm Bridget Sullivan Mermel, and I've got a fee-only financial planning practice in Chicago, Illinois. Before we get into the 200-year legacy, we want to remind people to please subscribe. It helps our credibility with YouTube and helps us feel appreciated. Anyway, so 200-year legacy. I'm really interested in what you have to say about this and how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, it's something that I came across a while back, and it's really interesting. And at first, when I heard that 200 years, like, that sounds crazy, right? Yeah. You think, like, we can remember back to the bicentennial in 1976, 200 years ago, like literally when the country was born. You think about these, like, what does that mean? And so I explain it like this. Think about a family that has a second generation, has kids every 30 years, because it's easy to do math, or easier to do math on 30 years. So go back somewhere, around the time we were born, let's say 1970, right? So if we were born in 1970, that means, and you go back 30 years, that means our parents were born about 1940. Right? And you go back another 30 years, and our grandparents were born about 1910, right? So grandparents in 1910, parents in 1940, us in 1970. And then go forward another 30 years. So then our kids born in the year 2000, and their kids, our grandkids, in the year 2030. Right, so there's 5 generations there. The kids born in 2030, if they've got a life expectancy, if they live until they're 70, that's out to the year 2100. Right, so think about from our grandparents to parents to us, kids, grandkids, stretching from 1910 to the year 2100. Right, 190 years doesn't sound quite so sexy as a lead-in, right? But basically a 200-year time period from grandparents to grandchildren, and that impact. And as I think about this, some of the meaningfulness or the usefulness is just getting beyond the short term and thinking, oh yeah, I know my grandparents, but this bigger picture of what type of influence, what things have my grandparents teach me, whether it's philosophical, values-based ethics, whether it's property, things, and then what can I do to set that up for my grandkids, and what are the things that we want to have? And again, we can get into a conversation about money, about values, about many things, but looking at that time period is really, I think, interesting and useful to think bigger than just ourselves in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in a couple different ways personally. So when you brought this topic up, one of the things I had just read somebody who's very successful saying that when they're faced with a decision, they thought about does it matter in 5 years? And to me that was really resonated because I can worry about a lot of things that really the answer to that question is no. It doesn't matter in 5 years. And so this is like, okay, what about 100 years?
Right.
And think back to what's my grandparents' legacy, my parents' legacy, and how is that all flowing? I think it's really an interesting topic.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about, okay, at first blush, I couldn't think of anything. But then I started thinking about one of my grandmas who was very into education, particularly for girls and women. And she had gone to UW-Madison, and she was in the 20s, and her sisters had too. And they would actually work and put each other through college. Okay. And this is grandma, right? And so, but it did have an effect because just like her valuing education passed on to my mom, passed on to me, passed on to my sisters, passed on to their kids, and my brothers, they're really smart too. I'm not dissing my brothers, but I would say that in my family, honestly, the girls' education is like one of the values. And again, this grandma wouldn't on her surface have a lot of, you wouldn't necessarily think about it, because a lot of times you might think more about what you don't want to do than what you when you're recalling some of your ancestors than what you do want to do. But in this case, it was really interesting. It really shone a light on I have that value too. I value girls and women's education in kind of a different way than some of the other things. So
Yeah, I wanted to pull out two things that you said there, Bridget. One is, I love that idea of, will this matter in 5 years?
Right.
Right. There are so many things for me anyway, on a day-to-day basis, and you get anxious about this or that, and you think about those, and at least for me, most of the things, it's not going to matter in 5 years, and to focus on those things where it is going to matter. And I think the same thing probably is true as you think, is this going to matter in 200 years, right? Does this make that impact on those things? And again, most things don't, but those things that do are, or at least could be, really critical, right? And think about that story you just shared about your grandmother and her sisters and how that went. And again, and I love that you said it's not necessarily on the surface what they would have said had you asked them the question, and yet what carries forward through the generations as you think down to the next generation beyond you, right? And so that was really insightful as I heard it, in that, so many of us today are in a position where it's not subsistence living, right? Easy for me to say. But one of those things, we just took a vacation recently down to the U.S. Southwest, and we did a little tour of the Hoover Dam, right? Really interesting engineering marvel. And one of the things that we had taken away and shared with our kids is that people, the number of people, and of course I forget the exact number, but thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people went there because it was built during the Great Depression to find work, but they only had jobs for 3,000 or 5,000 people or something to this effect. But the idea of literally, I'm going west to see if I can find work to make ends meet for my family, that sort of thing. So many of us are in a position, people watching this are, hey, we're thinking different things, right? We're not necessarily worried about where the next meal comes from, sort of thing. And then this idea of, well, what do we do with that? And thinking about, all right, what am I communicating to my, what I can control, right, to my children and grandchildren, and how can I draw back on those things that were meaningful, and being intentional about those, and not getting to, for some of us, certainly it's moving to the next level socioeconomically in those things. But once you get to a spot, then what? Then, you get to a position you want your kids to be even, whatever, richer than you or some other thing, and you go, I mean, maybe, but what else is meaningful, right? What's useful for that? It's just it's such a big thing, and I think some of this is just being able to think in that direction.
Yeah, and for me, again, it gets back to what are your, deeply held values. And so, so for instance, education is one of mine. And then another is, honestly, the environment. And I think for both of us, that's actually one of our values, although it plays out in different ways, And so you wouldn't think you live in the city. I live in the city of Chicago.
Right. There's a tree there, isn't there?
Yeah. I planted some. Yeah. And so, but the thing is, so trees in Chicago, there's all kinds of positive health benefits, and there was even a study that it helps with shootings. I don't think that. And maybe it's just because the environment's better, or maybe I don't think trees are getting shot too often. I don't, hopefully not. But anyway, and so it's interesting how when I think 200 years, when I think an extra 100 years, I think about that value. I want to do more in that regard and have more of an impact in that, maybe less of an impact in that regard.
It's interesting you brought up trees. So I own some farmland, and one of the things we do is plant a lot of trees and try to regenerate prairies and things. And you made me think of a story that I was out helping one of my friends out at the farm plant some trees, and my boys were there, and he was saying that, boy, we're planting these trees now, but it's going to be for my kids basically when the acorns fall off the trees for the animals and things like that. And I remember Gary asking my son, well, in 30 years, how old will you be? And so Vince did the math on that, and he said, Gary, well, how old will I be? And he said, well, geez, you'll be dead. And we all had a good laugh about that on the honesty of kids and things. But you think about that tree metaphor is really an interesting thing when you think about it, right? There's trees that are in, parks, places that have been around 200 years, right? And maybe that idea of what am I planting today that's not just for my children and not just for my grandchildren, but for my great-grandchildren and down the path, and that metaphorical, maybe it's a physical tree, which is an awesome, right? You think about the trees that you planted, and they're giving you a hard time about planting trees are going to be around for hopefully 100 or more years, right? Like a meaningful legacy. And then what are the metaphorical trees that we're planting of things like education for women and girls?
Right.
And I know I got from my parents the idea of taking care of people that can't take care of themselves, looking
right.
out for the underdog sort of thing. And for me, that manifests. It's interesting. I believe in charity and giving time and money, and it wasn't explicit. My parents didn't give a lot of time and money, but yet their careers were based on helping people. And interesting to think back on how I feel about things based on what I learned, and going, oh, it's really interesting to dig into those
Right.
things, and then to think about going forward. What is it that we want to do with our remaining time? And then, what type of trees are we planting now for the future? So
Great.
I guess maybe a great way to wrap things up here with this discussion on your 200-year legacy. Again, I'm John Scherer. I run a fee-only financial planning practice in Middleton, Wisconsin.
And I'm Bridget Sullivan Mermel, and I've got a family financial planning practice in Chicago, Illinois. John and I are both members of ACP, or the Alliance of Comprehensive Planners, which is a group of fee-only financial planners, comprehensive fee-only financial planners with a tax focus. And there's planners all over the country. So if you're looking for someone who thinks like we do, a great place to check is acplanners.org.
That's right. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button.